Welcome back to Into the Verse. This is Ari Levisohn, joined today by my colleague Daniel Loewenstein. Great to have you on, Daniel.
Great to be here.
So, Daniel, today I want to talk to you about some stuff that really blew my mind when I first found it. First, a quick recap of the Parsha. Yitro gets its name from Yitro, Moshe's father-in-law, who joins the Israelite camp and rearranges their legal system. But the real highlight of this week's Parsha is the revelation at Sinai. After 3 days of preparation, God came, descended on Mount Sinai in a thundery, fiery spectacle, and finally gives Bnei Israel the 10 Commandments, the Aseret HaDibrot. And those 10 Commandments, they're later written down on the two tablets, the Luchot, which become an extremely important symbol in Judaism. The synagogue I was davening at this morning had a huge depiction of the two tablets with the 10 Commandments right above the ark in the synagogue, like front and center. I imagine, Daniel, your shul probably has some depiction of them too.
Yeah, I mean, if not like 7 of them, sure, yeah.
Right, so when you have that depiction of the 10 Commandments and the tablets in your shul, what do those look like?
What do they look like? They're usually either rectangular or...
Shape-wise, right, they're some kind of rectangle. Maybe they're rounded at the top, maybe they're flat.
Right.
And then what's written on them?
Usually like the first 2 or 3 words of each of the 10 Commandments. 5 on one side, 5 on the other.
Right, you have the first 5 on one side, second 5 on the other side. So, okay, why am I asking you all this? Well, what if I told you that every depiction you have ever seen of the 10 Commandments on these two tablets is totally wrong?
I'd say that's a pretty bold claim to make, given the weight of all the history and tradition behind it. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that's going to need a lot of backing up.
Certainly, right? And it'd probably get me in a lot of trouble too. Well, the other day I was looking for that pasuk that says that the 10 Commandments were divided 5 and 5 on each tablet. Only I couldn't find it. It turns out that pasuk doesn't exist. Daniel, are you familiar with the Mandela effect?
Oh, I've definitely heard of it. As soon as you say it, I'm going to be like, oh, I know what that is, but it's not coming to me right now.
So it's named after the fact that somehow there became this like widespread memory that Nelson Mandela died in prison in the 80s. Right? Somehow like a bunch of people just became convinced that this is what happened and that they remember this happening. But of course, that just didn't happen. He lived until 2013. And yet somehow people just are sure that they remember this being the case. And this became known as the Mandela effect. So a really great example is that line from Star Wars that we all remember so well, when Darth Vader says to Luke Skywalker, Luke, I am your father.
Right. Well, he never says it. He says, I am your father, but he doesn't say, Luke, I am your father. Yeah.
Right. So that's what it felt like what's going on here is like this Mandela effect that I was sure that there was a pasuk that says there was written 5 and 5 on each of the two tablets, but it's not there at all, which led me to look around and see, well, what's the source of this, right? Where did we get this idea that we all know that's on every shul, this depiction of the two tablets with the 10 Commandments, 5 on each side? So that brought me to the Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon, which is a collection of midrashim, and a similar version of this is quoted in a few different places. So it starts off, Elahain Aseret HaDibrot. These are the 10 Commandments. But because basically it's actually, we know the 10 Commandments because it says there are 10 of them, but it's not so obvious exactly how to divide them. So here it is, setting the facts straight. This is how you divide them. Anochi, right? I am Hashem, your God. Lo yelecha, you shouldn't have any other gods. Lo tisav, zachor, etc., etc. So it lists all the 10 Commandments. And then, Daniel, can you read what it says next?
Yeah, it says, Chamisha aluach zeh v'chamisha aluach zeh. Divrei Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel. Oh, interesting. So it says that 5 were written on this tablet and 5 were written on that tablet, according to the opinion of Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, which implies there's another opinion, which is the next thing that says, V'chachamim omrin asara aluach zeh v'asara aluach zeh. Huh. So the opinion of the Chachamim is that all 10 were on each of them. I've never heard this before.
Isn't that shocking?
Yeah, that
Every
is...
depiction I've ever seen is 5 and 5. And yet, the opinion of the sages, the majority opinion, is that it was 10 and 10, that all 10 of the commandments were written on each of the two tablets.
I gotta say, I was not expecting to see that. Very, very interesting. Okay.
And, there is an opinion that it was 5 and 5, right? According to one Rabbi Chanina. So, yesh al mi lismoch, we don't have to go remodeling all of the shuls. But I couldn't get over the fact that it seems like the majority of the opinion of the sages is that that's not what they looked like.
Definitely sharing the same sentiment that you're expressing. And I'm like also thinking through a bunch of questions. I mean, like, I guess mainly they're historical questions, like what happened to this opinion and like how did it become so incredibly non-mainstream that like I've never even heard of it. But I guess also I'm interested textually if there's some sort of, textual root to this debate. Are they reading a verse differently? Is there some source that they're like understanding in different ways? Yeah, definitely a lot of questions.
Right. I'm sure some of our listeners are better historians than you or I, and maybe have some idea of how this minority opinion ended up becoming so widespread. But we also have to ask the question of what are they basing this opinion on, right? Where do they get this from? Is there anything that they're reading that makes them say this? And then also, well, if all 10 are written on each of the two tablets, and why do we have these two identical tablets? What's the point of that? It's redundant.
Oh, that's a much better question than the one I had.
Well, let's deal with your question first, though, because that is really important. So this debate between Rabbi Hanina and the sages is actually quoted in a few different places in rabbinic literature. And in most of the other places where it's quoted, the sages bring the following verse as their proof for why they believe that the Ten Commandments were written, all 10 on each tablet. And the verse they quote is Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 13. This is Moses retelling the story of the revelation experience at Sinai. And he says, Vayiged lachem et brito, asher tziva etchem la'asot, aseret hadvarim, right? So God told you this covenant, which he commanded you to do, right? These 10 things. Vayichtavim al shnei luchot avanim. And he wrote them on the 2 stone tablets.
Yeah, so it seems to me they're reading something like, it says, aseret hadarim, that they're the 10 things. And then it just says, Vayichtavim, he wrote those 10 things, al shnei luchot avanim, on these 2 tablets. So I guess they're just inferring like he wrote this thing on each of the tablets. I understand how that's like a viable read of the verse.
Yeah, it certainly seems viable, although it's somewhat ambiguous as to what it means, how those 10 were written onto the 2 tablets. And in fact, Rabbi Hanina actually quotes the exact same verse to support his opinion.
Yep, that's ambiguity for you.
So the commentators on these rabbinic sources try to figure out, when each of them are quoting this verse to support their opinion, what are they reading into it? What are they noticing that they're trying to use to actually prove their point? Right? Because the way that these drashot, these exegesis of Chazal usually work is, right, they find some nuance, some extra word that doesn't need to be there that allows them to say what they're saying.
Did the commentators point out something like specific here about what makes the Chachamim have their approach?
Yeah, so the commentators actually have a few different theories as to what it might be. One theory is it's the combination of talking about saying the 10 Commandments and writing the 10 Commandments. And they say just as they were said all 10 together, so too they were written all 10 together on each one of the 2 tablets. There's a totally different explanation that it's the words aseret hadvarim, these 10 things, because really you could read the whole verse without those words. So they're somewhat superfluous in this verse, and maybe the words these 10 things is coming to say that it was all 10 things that were written on each one of the tablets.
Those all sound like very like kind of classic midrash style ways of interpreting a pasuk. It's not like, you read it and you kind of just intuit from a literary sense, like this is what it means, but it's just like kind of very carefully paying attention to extra words and that kind of stuff, which, makes sense, but obviously there's that ambiguity.
Right. And it also feels like there's got to be something more here. Because these all say like the how of how they make this read.
Right, but it doesn't talk about the why.
Exactly. It doesn't talk about the why. And I think the best way to approach it is what Rabbi Foreman calls his gunpowder and trigger theory. Are you familiar with this?
I don't think I'm familiar with this analogy.
So rather than explain it myself, I'm actually just going to let Rabbi Foreman explain it. Here's a recording of him explaining this metaphor on a podcast.
My trigger and gunpowder theory. If you're going to fire a gun, you need 2 things, right? You have to pull a trigger, but you also need gunpowder in the chamber, right? In order for a medrash to be a medrash, you got to have a trigger and you got to have gunpowder in the chamber. The trigger is the nominal diuk, which is happening in the text, which is an anomaly, which Rashi or the Medrash is picking up on and becomes the basis for a drash. Chazal would never say what they were saying without gunpowder. Gunpowder is that Chazal had a larger 50,000 foot view of what was going on, and they were bothered with larger themes within the story.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess what Roy Foreman seems to be saying or arguing is that like Chazal don't just make drushas to make drushas. When a medrash makes a point, it always has some sort of basis in the text for making its point, but its point is actually something larger than just the textual nuance picking up on it and its explanation. There's some sort of like larger, philosophical or metaphysical point that it's making, and we shouldn't just assume that midrashim are just there to like make interesting casual observations that have no meaning to our lives, which I think fits with Roy Foreman's larger view, which I think is a really important perspective on Torah in general, which is that it's not a literary book and it's not a history book, it's a guidebook. And so everything in there actually has some sort of actual like meaningful substance and bearing on our lives.
Yeah, exactly. And so whatever anomaly that sages noticed in this verse in Devarim, that was just the trigger. But there had to be some gunpowder there, some deeper reason why they're saying all 10 commandments are written on each one of the tablets. So what is that deeper reason? They don't say. It's left for us to try to look for. But what jumped out to me is actually a word in the verse that they quoted, which is the word brit, covenant. This verse, it's describing the 10 commandments as a covenant. And that's not the way I'm used to thinking about the 10 commandments, but the more I looked into it, I realized the Torah actually seems to be pretty clear that that's what the 10 commandments are. In Exodus chapter 19, verse 5, this is in the preparation for the revelation at Sinai. It says, V'ata im shema tishma bekoli. And now if you listen to my voice, mushmartem et briti, and if you keep my covenant, Vayitzam li sigula mikol hamim, then you will be for me a treasured nation amongst all the nations. And at this point, we haven't gotten the 10 commandments yet, but that covenant appears to be the 10 commandments.
Right. And there are themes there about like, we'll be God's holy nation and he'll be our God. There's definitely some sort of element of like a both sides kind of event happening that's culminating at Sinai.
Yeah, and then when the 10 commandments are actually written on the tablets, in Exodus chapter 34, verse 28, it says, Vayichtov al luchot et divrei habrit, aseret hadvarim. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, these 10 things. Right? So I think it's pretty clear that what the 10 commandments are is a covenant.
Okay.
We keep the 10 commandments. God will treat us as his treasure nation.
Yes. I think you've proved certainly beyond a shadow of a doubt that what was happening with the 10 Commandments was a brit. How does that help us figure out why we need 2 copies?
Right. So if the 10 Commandments are a covenant, a brit, and they're written on the luchot, and the luchot are described as like luchot habrit, the tablets of the covenant, or actually earlier on, luchot haidut, the tablets of the testimony. If you're going to write down a covenant, why might you want 2 copies of it?
I'm going to walk right into this one. And I'm going to say you want 1 copy for each party.
Exactly. You want 1 copy for each party. It makes total sense.
I mean, it almost makes total sense.
It almost makes total sense. Why?
Yeah, I mean, like, so far, like, a lot of things are lining up really, really nicely here, right? You're pointing out this is a covenant, and that, like, covenants have 2 parties. So, like, if there's an opinion that's reading this verse and saying, oh, the luchot are actually, 2 copies of the exact same thing, then it would really make a lot of sense to say, like, okay, great, there's a copy for each party. And, if the 2 parties here, like, one party's God and one party is the Israelites, so then sort of everyone knows these are the things that were established, and, like, here's your copy, Israel, and, like, here's your copy, God. And that sounds like a totally viable explanation for why there'd be 2 copies of the exact same thing. And it's also kind of like a beautiful explanation because it's sort of emphasizing the kind of the covenantal aspect of it, that like the 2 sides aspect of it, that like, that it was important for this thing to be established and kept as a record or testimony for both parties, right? There's like an elegance to it.
And, I was wondering, like, this actually makes sense according to like our modern understanding of like covenants. You make 2 carbon copies of any contract that you're going to sign. But I did a little historical research, and it turns out that we actually have evidence of a treaty signed between the Hittites and the Egyptians, actually in the reign of Ramses II, who, according to a lot of historians, was actually the Pharaoh of the Exodus. These two nations fought for almost 20 years and then decided to make peace, and they signed this covenant, and they each have a written copy of this covenant. We've discovered these nearly identical copies that are written in stone, one in Egypt and one with the Hittites.
So you're saying like it's not even like anachronistic of us to say like, oh, two parties, two copies. Like that was practiced for a long time in history.
Yeah, and it's probably even more similar to the Hittite Caesarean vassal treaty, where you have kind of one power that's above and one that's below. And we won't go all into that now. We'll put a link to the description. It's really interesting if you want to look into that.
We're not going into the Hittite Caesarean treaty now. Ari, such a tease.
Okay, fine. You insist.
I guess the only thing that I'm like a little hung up on or hesitant about, maybe not so little, unless I'm very much misremembering the way things unfolded. I think both copies stayed downstairs. You'd expect, to have each party keep a copy, then there'd be like one for the Jewish people and one for God, and they'd be like split up and separated, and each person gets to keep his copy, so to speak. That's like the only thing that sort of strikes me as odd about it, but otherwise it's a really cool idea and it's intriguing. Does that question make sense?
Exactly. That's the question. If this is just this agreement, two parties, and each of them are supposed to have a copy, why don't they each take their copy and split? But let's think about it for a second. If you're Bnei Yisrael and you have your copy of the treaty, this is like the most important possession that you own. Where's the best place you could put that? It's the same place, by the way, that we keep the container of man, which we're told to store as a memory. It's the same place that we keep the copy of the Sefer Torah that we're never supposed to forget.
Right. It's not a Chase security deposit box. Yeah, right. I guess it would make sense that the most sacred, holy, secure, and appropriate site would probably be putting it in the Aron Kodesh, which is where indeed it was kept, or they were kept.
Yeah, it's at the center of the whole camp. It's the holiest place, the most secure. And in fact, in the Caesarean vassal treaties, that's exactly where they kept these stone tablets of their covenants, was
in the Aron Kodesh?
In the Aron Kodesh. It was just chock full, overflowing.
No, but actually, what do you mean?
In their own temples. That was the place that they would keep them. And that's where archaeologists have discovered them. But now think about, if you're God, where's the most logical place to put your copy? If there is anywhere on earth that would make sense to put your copy, where would it be?
Yeah, probably in the holiest place. That is the place that God is most manifest, which coincidentally is the Aron Kodesh.
Right, it's exactly the same place.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so in theory, you have these two copies, one for us and one for God. And in theory, we could take them and go our own way. But the best place for each of us to put them happens to be the same place, which is at the center of this Mishkan.
This is really interesting and really compelling. I'm kind of like wondering, I'm like thinking to myself about whether it's just like a funny coincidence that like the place to store the covenant for both parties happens to be the same place, or if there's like kind of maybe something deeper to it. And like, and I don't know. I mean, I think anything I would say would be speculative, but one thing I'm kind of thinking about is like this custom that a lot of Jewish families have to hang up a ketubah in their house, which is like a really funny thing to do, because a ketubah is it's like a marriage contract. I think there's like this kind of romantic quality attached to it by a lot of people, but it's like very technical and very monetary, and like, it's kind of funny if you kind of actually read it and know what it's talking about. But like people make it beautiful and they get it really nice, really nicely framed. They put it in their houses, like on display. And kind of the reason I'm thinking about that is because I feel like in all of your like, ancient Near East Hittite examples of covenants, I think they were really like, there were two separate parties that lived in geographically distinct locations and had their own interests and wanted to form some sort of covenantal relationship to sort of guarantee, this is how I'll treat you, this is how you'll treat me. But like, essentially, they're different, right? It was kind of really interesting about like a married couple with a contract. They kind of only need one because they're a unit, even though it's representing two different interests there. But the point is that the covenant is making them into kind of one unit. And it's not just like an alliance of convenience or some sort of formalization of rules between two distinct parties, but it's actually representing people's interests coming together in an incredibly deep way. So that even if there are like technical covenantal legal aspects of it, the fact that is a a proxy or an outcome of the fact that there's this kind of beautiful thing that they've entered into, you don't need 2 copies of a ksuba. And it can be something that you hang up in your house as like a sign of what you have together. And I guess I'm just wondering if there's something similar going on. I mean, I know a lot of people like to talk, whether, more literally or more allegorically, about like a marriage happening with God at Har Sinai. But however you slice it, the fact that God asks for a Mishkan to be built as a dwelling place for him to live among the people of Israel and bring himself as close as possible to earth and let us be as close as possible to him in his heavens by having this one central location that's in the middle of the Israelite camp, it's definitely more of like the closest of a marriage covenant than it is like the distance and distinctness of Caesar and the Hittites or whatever the other example would be. And so maybe there is something that's like kind of very apropos or symbolic of the fact that it's in the same place because it's not a covenant that's establishing ground rules for separate parties, but it's actually establishing ground rules for parties that are kind of uniting.
Yeah, God's coming to them and saying, I want to live with you. I want to move in, right? Like I want to like join together in this like really special, close, intimate relationship. And, Daniel, you're talking about, other breeds maybe being 2 separate parties. I mean, just look at the examples that we have in the Torah of breeds that people make with each other. Right? Avraham makes a brit with Avimelech, Yitzhak makes a brit with Avimelech, and Yaakov makes a brit with Lavan. And in each one of these cases, it's 2 people who really don't get along with each other, and they are basically making mutual non-aggression pacts, right? They're saying, like, you're going to go one way, I'm going to go my other. And in each one of these cases, after they make this brit, they split and never see each other again. Like, that's the point of it. It's like, we don't like each other. We don't really want to have anything to do with each other, so we're going to make this covenant so that we can split and never see each other again.
It's really interesting, yeah.
And God's is the exact opposite. He's saying,
Right.
I'm introducing myself to you, and I want to have a lifelong relationship with you. And so it's going to be modeled after these other covenants, and it's going to start in the same way. We're each going to have our own copy of it. But instead of taking those copies and splitting, we're both going to put those copies in our shared home.
Yeah, that definitely feels a little bit more than coincidental.
Yeah. And, we kind of take for granted the fact that God wants to have this relationship with us. But I guess that's really not something so obvious. I mean, especially when you compare it to everything else that B'nai Israel as a people have experienced until this point in their history. All the encounters that they've had with other people who are just like, the best they can hope for is to coexist. This relationship that they're about to begin building with God is really something remarkable. And here we have the 2 tablets as a symbol of that. And still to this day, we put images of those tablets everywhere, whether we're holding like the minority opinion, or maybe they should all look a little bit different. Yeah, every time we see those, it's a reminder of God's desire for closeness.
Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit about your point, like, because there is this whole like, maybe should we hiring new architects or new designers for our shuls and stuff. But I think kind of like a weirdly maybe appropriate takeaway for me, thinking about the Chachamim's perspective on the luchos, is that like I think like when I see a model of the luchos in my shul, and it only has one of them, there's kind of something like appropriate about that because we're supposed to have a Beis Hamikdash and a location that has both of those things where God's home really is.
Yeah.
So, I think there's like absolutely nothing wrong with looking at the luchos models in shul and kind of being inspired by the, these guidelines that God gave us to live good, godly lives and have like a very positive feeling about it. But there's also kind of like a somewhat sad and maybe somewhat, longing or hopeful way of looking at it also, which is that we're looking forward to the time when we actually have both luchos together, and it's not just us in our small houses of worship yearning for God, but God also in his house yearning for connection with us.
That's this week's episode. To listen to last year's episodes, as well as our world-famous Parsha and holiday videos, head on over to aleph-beta.org and sign up for a membership.